Karun, first of all, I guess, we all have to begin by asking one another how it's going in the lockdown, what you've been up to, what it's been like for you guys.
Well, unlike you, Peter, I left the city of London a few years ago, so we've actually been lucky. We got the space and the countryside out here. To be honest, not much to complain about. I think we've all stayed healthy. The shops and people around here have all done a great job, and there's a sense of community. Yeah, I mean the sun's been shining, hasn't it? Can you imagine if we were in December, January? I think this would be a very different phase.
Karun, having your finger on the motor racing pulse as you do, what's your best view at the moment of the 2020 Formula One World Championship calendar?
It sort of changes on a weekly basis. There's some weeks or some days where I feel optimistic. We're all going to go to Austria and then carry on and manage to get 15 races in. And then the next day you have a conversation with someone else and you think, actually, hang on a second, this may not work. And so I keep going back and forth, sometimes, to be honest, within the same day, depending on who you speak to and what problems arise, when you have this conversation. So I can see. I think there's a decent plan coming together to get to Austria. I think the difficulty is what happens after that, because then you're into the realms of quarantine periods for people to get in and out of the country. You got 7 out of the 10 teams in the UK. So can they leave personnel out on the continent for 3 months at a time? That's not going to be popular with their families, but is that really something that's going to happen? British Grand Prix, they've announced 2 potential dates, but now if there's a 14-day quarantine period to come back in, that's open up a whole other set of problems. So, and this is I think, Peter, this is a really dynamic situation, isn't it? It's a really fluid situation. There's news coming out of Texas today saying there's concerns about the health issues there, and they don't think the race can happen in Austin potentially now. I saw just on the BBC website the curves for Brazil, Russia, and Mexico are still on the way up. It seems they haven't yet got to the peak, unlike Europe. So, yeah, there's a whole host of hurdles, I think, to solve. I wouldn't want to be in Ross Brawn or Steve Nielsen or Chase Carey's shoes at the moment. I really sympathise with them because it's not an easy job to solve.
Karun, moving on from that, I'm really interested to get your take on what was the 2021 car, which is now presumably the 2022 car, assuming things continue to go according to plan. You will have in your mind started to think about what that car is going to feel like compared with an existing car.
I think there's 3 things to think about that immediately jump to my mind. One is the fact that you're going to have less downforce. There's no question about it. The downforce is going to be generated in a different way. So the front wing they've talked about is a much simplified version of what we have now. And I think that's absolutely the right thing to do for raceability. And this is a really, really important word that I think we as a community need to keep shouting out is the word raceability. That's why we're doing this, to make the cars better, easier to follow and better racing. I draw a parallel to GP2, Peter, when we had a simple, single main plane. Those of you watching, if you haven't seen it, Google the image, but it's a single main plane, and then we had 2 flaps on the front wings. So very simple front wing design. But you could, and because we had tunnels and skirts, so they had the ground effects to generate the downforce, we still had really good cornering speeds. The lap times, we weren't far away. We were only a couple seconds off the back of the grid of Formula One, and the cornering speeds were very good. But you could follow people. We could go through cops, and you could be right under the gearbox. And yes, you'd lose a little bit of downforce. Of course you would. But you could still follow each other, race each other, and then hopefully we can get rid of DRS. As a purist, I'm not a fan of DRS. I like to see old school proper overtaking. Like we saw Mansell on Piquet into Stowe in 1987. That's what we want to see. There's none of this push a button and go faster, and I think that's really important. So as a driver, I think you'll have less downforce, but hopefully you'll have better racing. The weight is going to go up, which is not a good thing. The cars already are very heavy. When I drove Lewis's car from last year, that's the one thing that struck me was actually how much heavier the cars were, and they weren't as agile as previous ones that I've driven. And that's going up because we got bigger wheels, bigger brakes, and tires. So it's going up, I think, by 22 or 23 kilos they've talked about. And that's not insignificant. That's a lot of weight also hanging out. If you remember, it's not in the center of the car. It's out there on the suspension. And then obviously the tires are the big unknown, because I can only draw comparisons from when I went from single-seater to sports cars, where we went from the 13-inch to then 18-inch low-profile and sports cars. And all of a sudden, the curbs, you couldn't ride the curbs as well. The amount of load that the damping load the tires did was much less. So the teams and drivers will all have to adapt to that tire. And I think that's a really underestimated thing in this whole scenario. Is people are talking about the aero and how the cars will look and lap time. But the tire is going to make a difference to the way they design the rest of the car. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but it is quite a complex subject, really.
But are you an advocate for bigger tyres, bigger wheels?
I'm not fussed either way, to be honest. I'm not an advocate for more weight. I think that's gone the wrong way. I think, and that it starts with Formula One and it goes down the ladder, right? Today I look at, it's interesting. I was writing a column the other day, and I dug out some lap times from when I raced in GP2 in 2008 versus 2019. And the lap times in 2019 are more or less the same at all circuits, sometimes even slower. Like Barcelona, they're a couple of tenths slower. And you go, hang on, in 12 years, we've not made any progress here. That's not right to me. And a large part of that is the cars have got heavier. Tires have changed and the cars have got heavier. So I'm not fussed about bigger or smaller tires. If the manufacturer of the tires think they have to do that for marketing reasons, so be it. But I think the weight thing is a negative.
You mentioned the front wing, the basic front wing on a GP2 car. You're referring to the 2008 GP2 car, are you?
Or 2007, or frankly, I think even the one now is quite a simple design.
Interesting that Peter Wright, the man who invented skirts, who discovered skirts and put them on the Lotus 78 and then the 79, said recently that in his view, one of the most obvious ways of making it much easier to follow another car is simply to put skirts even on the existing cars. It would tidy things up so much that the drivers would be astonished at how quickly they could follow. The skirts you had, having said all that, the skirts you had weren't skirts in the old sense of the word, but you think there's something that perhaps we should still look at for Formula One in 2022?
I think it has to be a package. I think when you look up close at the complexity of a modern front wing on a car, it needs to be in the Tate Museum. It's extraordinary, and the bargeboard area, it's too much. You just look at it and go, it's just too much. And why do we need all of this stuff? Is you're sort of, when you look at it holistically, yeah, they're beautiful, but it just seems over the top. I look at cars. I was actually watching. That's what I've done in lockdown, by the way. I've rewatched some old season F1 reviews, and I watched the one from 2000 a couple of nights ago, and it's fantastic. The cars look so much simpler than they are now, but they still look quick. And you had Mika versus Michael able to race wheel to wheel. You had great battles on track. And the cars still look fast. So they don't look slower because they're still light and agile. They were only 600 odd kilos at that time. But so much simpler when you look at them.
Yeah, the light and agile adjectives are the problem, aren't they? And that, of course, is a function of all the stuff we need in the car for the hybrid engines. And that's where we've gone, and we all know that's the reason for the weight. So I guess the next question is your take on that in terms of the future of the sport. Any lessons, any time that we've had to think during this lockdown period about where we're going with Formula One? Is this still the way forward, or perhaps is there another solution staring us in the face that we haven't been considering?
I think there's a clear line of thought from the engine manufacturers, isn't there? Or I should call them power unit manufacturers, that they want F1 to be hybrid. That they are very, very adamant on that. And it does seem that on that particular point, all four of them are aligned for a change. You know, it's very hard to get anyone in F1 to align on anything, but that and unfortunately, then we're stuck with it, right? You know, unless there's a change of thought process there, or if there's another way to get the engine supplied across the teams. I think we do need the engine manufacturers. I'm not saying they have to be works teams like we have now, but you could go back to having Williams, Renault, or you know, you had Benetton, Ford, and people like that. So it's like Red Bull, Honda now, really, isn't it? You know, the engine people are just purely the engine; they don't do the whole team. And I think that's part of F1 history, and that's part of the F1 DNA. I mean, you know, the name McLaren, Honda, or Williams, Renault is such a big part of F1 history. So I can, you know, maybe we'll go back to that model, but I think the hybrids are here to stay. So it's not a point that I waste energy thinking about, because I can't see that changing.